Hello world, I'm Whitney Bandel and welcome to another video from my HTML and CSS course. In this video, we will be looking at fragment identifiers, web page files, and testing and validation. Alright, so let's go ahead and open up our text editor. We'll save this as fragment.html. I'm going to go ahead and open this up. We'll start our code the same way that we always do. You can use the template if you would like to. Let's title this fragment identifier. Whoops. And we'll leave some space to add embedded styles. Alright, so when we are looking at fragment identifiers, we're talking about a way to link information within a page. And this would be a good time for us to take a look at how to write links in general. We've talked before about how to create a basic anchor link, but from here on out we are going to start working with more and more media files, and so it would be good to review how we can actually reference information that is within a slightly different organizational structure. So let's actually add this information in our code for now. We might not leave this, but it'd be good for us to just write this down. So I'm going to create an H1, call this folder organization. We'll create a paragraph and we'll say linking to files within folders. Then let's say a regular link looks like we'll do another one linking to pages within a folder. A link to a file within a folder looks like to returning back to a previous folder. Turning back to a larger folder looks like we'll say returning back to a previous folder before entering another folder. Changing folders looks like save this, refresh, so we can take a look at our notes. So up until this point, we've been pretty much doing all of our links, having everything in the same folder hierarchy. So everything, if we have had a folder, has all been in the same folder. Same thing with your homework assignments. Everything's been in the same folder. So if you link to anything, you don't need to have anything in front of the actual file name. You just need the actual file name, the proper file extension. If you are going to link to a page that's within a folder, then you need to specify the folder name that you are going to enter, / and then the actual file. So let's actually create an example. Call this website. Call this pages, images, CSS, in pages. We'll create a page that's called About. So if we look at this structure in comparison, we change the view. That's a little too large. Okay. So we have a folder called website, and here we have a CSS folder. This is where we could put our CSS styles. We have a folder for our images, if we had a bunch of images. And then we have our individual website pages, so our HTML would go in here. A lot of times you'll also have a folder for your JavaScript files. So right now we don't have any media or anything to add, we just have our pages. So part of the confusing thing about writing your links is you have to think about where you are creating the link from. So if we had, let's create another page. If we had a page called Contact, and we were creating a link in our navigation to the About page, because they are in the same folder, we can just use about.html for our link. If we were in this folder and we were creating a link, maybe we had our home page. So let's do maybe for some reason we have our home page is going to be outside of all of these files, and then we have our pages kind of going. If we think of our sitemap, we have this is the first step, and then we have our primary navigation. Maybe we have folders in here that link to secondary items on our sitemap. So if we are linking from these pages to each other, we just need the name of the other file. If we were creating a link from index, we would need to write it like this, where we would need to say, I want to link to a file that is contained within pages, and then choose About. If you were returning back to a previous folder, and better example of this one, go back to our code. It'd actually be if we change this to index. So if we were actually on one of these pages and we wanted to link to our index page, we'd actually have to return to the previous folder, which is containing this folder. So we'd be going back a step and then finding the file with this name. And this, let's change to images. And let's just call this photo. Change this to a JPEG. Now we don't actually have this file. So what we could have here is an image that we are linking to. The image is going to be shown on our About page. Maybe it's a photo of us. And in this instance, when we are creating the link, we are saying that from this folder, we want to move back, enter another folder, like images, and then find the file that says photo on it. So this is just a good review for looking at how you can organize your links, and it's all relative again to whatever page that you're actually working from. And it's important to write out your sitemap and think about that structure beforehand so that way you know exactly how your pages relate to each other. So a fragment identifier is another type of link. Let's go ahead and add another H1. Type in fragment identifier. Fragment identifiers are used to link to a specific portion of a website So where you might use a fragment identifier would be if you had, let's say, a really long page and you had all of your content for your website all on one page, and you wanted to allow people to jump to a section later on that page. So let's say you had a frequently asked question list and you had a bunch of different questions. Somebody could click on a link that would take them halfway down the page to a particular area, so they wouldn't have to scroll through all that information themselves. Another way that you might want to use this is if you were going to have a link at the bottom of your page to return to the top. This could be really helpful with a mobile version, similar to the idea of having the navigation on the bottom. You could have a fragment identifier which would take you all the way back up to the top. It can also be a great way for people who are using assistive technologies to be able to jump to information quicker and be able to find information that is specific to certain keywords that they are looking for. Alright, so above our folder organization, let's create a link. And we're going to say fragment.html. So we want to say the actual page that we're on. And then we're going to do hashtag. And then we're going to say, let's just say content. And then we'll say skip to content. So a fragment identifier requires two parts. And we could add this, there's another paragraph. A fragment identifier requires two parts, a link and content with a matching ID. Refresh. So here we have the link, which is at the very top. So what we need now is an ID. So in our H1, we're going to add an ID. And we're going to call this content. Save, refresh. So now if we click on skip to content, it would take us to the ID on this page. So it's a little hard to see if your content is kind of short and close to the top, if you resize your window so it's as small as possible, you'll see that we'll actually jump down to that section to be able to look at. Alright, so we are going to practice using this a little bit. We can go ahead and hit save, and let's actually start a new file. Let's go to save as. We can just do this on the desktop, and let's say favorites.html. For the title, let's say favorites. Just have it match. We'll leave room for embedded styles. Hit save. And open this up as well. Alright, so I want you to fill this out based off of your own information. So we're going to start with an H1. And I want you to put your name. I'm going to put in mine. We'll say your favorites. And then we're going to create a couple of different lists of different types of favorites. So we're going to create an H2 that will go next, and we're going to give this an ID, which is going to be called categories. This is going to be favorite categories. And so you'll notice we're giving an ID to this section, which is going to mean that when we are done, when we're done looking at a category lower on the page, we're going to create returns so we can return back to essentially the master list of different categories. And then we're going to create links to take us to lower sections. So we'll create a link to href equals, and we'll do favorites.html. And then we're going to create a couple of categories. So we're going to have a movies category. This will take us to favorite movies. And they're going to create a return. I'm going to move this over just a little bit for now. Create another link. This will be favorites.html. And then we'll do books. We'll do animals. Foods. And then music. So I'm going to hit return, just kind of help break this up visually into sets. We can actually hit save, refresh this just so you have an idea what this is going to look like. So here we have our, essentially our title going across, our first group, which has our categories. We're going to create another H2 with an ID. This one will be equal to our first category, movies. And then we'll say my favorite movies. Do an H2. And then here you'll actually create an ordered list. And you'll give us 5 items. For your category. And then once you have this idea down, actually, let's go ahead and add a link. We'll do favorites.html hashtag categories. And then we'll say click here to return to the categories list. Refresh that. So this will essentially be our set. So we're going to highlight this and copy it, and then we'll paste it 4 more times. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's see if we have. And then you'll want to go through and actually change these as needed. So our first category is going to be movies. Our second one should be books. Then animals. Foods. And then music. And then it's essentially just a matter of you going in and actually filling out this information. So you could go ahead and do that if you wanted to. Let's take a look at this file as a smaller window. So if we scroll through, we can find that information if we wanted to. But what we can also do is we can click and choose a category. So movies, I can return to my category list, click on books, go to the top, click on animals. It looks like there's something wrong with my link for animals. Might have written my ID wrong. Oh, I did uppercase. Whoops. Alright, let's try again. Animals. I did the same thing with food. I was getting ahead of myself and thinking about how I was going to capitalize my heading. Okay, food. Yep, did the same thing with music. Alright, so now each of these are going to work. So this is going to be one of the requirements that is going to be included on your final project. So you want to know how to be able to use these in a website. This might be something that would be good to have on a page that has a lot of information, like the course description, or on your credits. You could maybe list all of the credits for your information. Maybe all of your images will be in one category with a credit list, all of the articles that you used or the sites, or even just this idea of being able to click on a link and go back to the top of a page. This could be really helpful if you were looking at something in a mobile view, or you could easily kind of change where you are on the page. So to start off, we're going to be looking at the first link under web publishing, which is a PowerPoint. So web publishing basics. So to start off with, we're going to look at domain name basics. Domain names are the name of the website, the name following at in an email address, or after www in a web address. Examples are google.com, wikipedia.org, or jccc.edu. Domain names usually cost about $30 a year. Now, the difference between a domain name versus a URL. A URL is a complete web address used to find a particular web page, while a domain is the name of the website. A URL will lead to any one of those pages within the website. Every URL contains a domain name, as well as other components needed to locate that specific page or a piece of content. So some examples would be www.google.com, en.wikipedia/wiki/umami, www.youtube/feed/trending. So looking at specific pages or areas within a site in addition to just the domain. So to start off with, you need to register a domain name. Here are some tips for things to consider. It should make sense based off of what the website actually is. You want to keep it short, so that way it's less likely that someone might forget what the domain name is, or so that way they don't have a hard time trying to type it all out. You want to avoid using hyphens because they can overly complicate. You can use more than .com. A lot of people will choose .com, but nowadays there are a lot more options for other alternatives that you can use, and sometimes there are alternatives that will make more sense based off of the type of content your website actually has. You want to avoid using trademarked words that other established companies are using, so that way you don't encounter any sort of problems with those companies. And you want to have an idea of what other people are using, so that way you, again, aren't using trademarked words, but then you're also seeing what common trends are. You can verify the availability of different domain names. Here are a couple of different websites that you can go to that will be able to let you know whether or not a domain name is available or not. Now, there's a difference between purchasing a domain name and actually hosting your website. So purchasing a domain name is different than hosting your website, though usually you will do both together. A web hosting service provider provides technologies and services needed for the website or web page to be viewed in the internet. Websites are hosted or stored on special computers called servers. The domain name points to this storage when people type in the IP address. So when you are purchasing web hosting, you are purchasing the ability to store your website on one of these servers, and then the domain name will allow for people to access that location. So you can purchase them separately. You can purchase a domain name and transfer it between different web hosting companies. So here is a link on how you can try to find the best web host for you. You will be completing an assignment which will build off of this idea, where you will be required to do some research, but this can help you figure out what sort of web host is going to be best for you. There's not going to be a one-size-fits-all answer. It's going to depend a lot on a bunch of different type of criteria. This graphic is a little bit old, but it shows you 10 top web hosting providers back in 2014. Now, when you are creating your website and you're thinking of these key terms, for example, for your domain name, you want to consider search engine optimization. So a couple of tips: use keywords that people might search for. A good example I'd like to use for this is the idea of looking for help with your car. So for example, my husband used to work as a mechanic, and he liked to call himself an automotive technician. But if somebody was experiencing car trouble and they wanted to look to see how to get their car fixed, if they were to go into a search engine, rather than typing up automotive technician, they're probably going to use words that are more common, such as mechanic. They might look for car repair. They might look for a name of a typical website that they know to go to for looking up car-related help. They might not use words that are more valid or more used in the industry. They're going to be looking for layman terms. So you want to think about the types of keywords that people are actually going to be searching for, even if they technically aren't as appropriate. Use descriptive page titles. So you want to have your titles describe the content, and again, be common terms that people are going to be familiar with. And then finally, you want to use semantic HTML. Now, since we are studying HTML5, you are going to be using semantic HTML anyways. Semantic HTML is making sure that you are actually using your HTML properly in a way where the structure makes sense with the elements that you are using. For example, putting your header content inside of a header element, putting your navigation links inside of an element that's actually called a navigation element, and so on. So some things that you can do with SEO is creating these description tags. To add a description tag, you will create a meta name and list it as a description. You can choose what the content is going to be equal to. To keep search engines from indexing a website, you can actually add properties that will make it harder for the search engine to actually comb through your content. So here we have content, no index, no follow. To indicate not to index the whole website, you can also create this disallow, which will prevent the whole website from being indexed. How to make your website SEO friendly. Verify that all hyperlinks work. Be careful which links you use from other websites. You want to make sure you don't have any awkward dead ends, or that you're not linking to questionable websites, which will bring the reputation of your website down. Use meaningful alternative text descriptions for your images. Make sure that you validate your code and that your code meets the proper standards. Make sure your content is good. You want to make sure that you don't have any spelling or grammar errors. You want to make sure that your content isn't out of date. You don't have a bunch of pages that just say coming soon. Include keywords and titles, headers, first paragraphs, and hyperlinks. So when you're thinking of those key terms, you want to make sure that you are repeating them so that way it's easier for people to skim through your information and find exactly what's pertinent to them. So some general web file naming conventions. Use all lowercase when you are naming your files. Use hyphens instead of spaces. Your file links will not recognize white spaces, so you will get an error if you use spaces in your links. So you want to make sure that if you do have multiple words and you want to make them more legible, that you use hyphens instead of spaces. Avoid using any sort of special character. Make your files brief. You don't want to have a really long file name. You want to keep it as short as possible while making it still legible and make sense. Use a name that reflects the file. Be careful with version names. So this really comes down to how you're going to be linking files. If you're working on a really large website, it can be really difficult to go back and actually have to reversion everything. Let's say you have a photo that is just referred to as photo.jpg. Let's say you wanted to replace a photo and the new photo was called photo maybe v2 for version 2. If you bring that file in without changing the link name, now that file is no longer going to be linked properly in your HTML. So what a lot of times I'll encourage you to do is if you are going to have version names, that you keep those separate and then you copy them into a new file where you will rename the file with the file name that works with the current link that's on that website. So next we're going to look at publishing with File Transfer Protocol, and we will have a separate video which will show you how to work with FileZilla in order to publish your files. FTP stands for File Transfer Protocol. It's used for transfer of computer files between a client and a server. Your web host might have their own service for transferring files. Otherwise, you can use an FTP software like FileZilla. FileZilla is the one that we're going to be using. When you are researching your web hosts, you might find that some of them talk a little bit about their own transferring file system. And some of them are actually more client friendly because they have more of a click and drop sort of setup rather than having to go through another software. File validation. You can validate your code files before publishing them to your website, and I encourage you to do this with every single one of your assignments that you will turn in. Once they are published, you should use the W3 School Validator to check your HTML and your CSS files. So here are again those two links, the first taking you to the validator for HTML, and the second to the CSS validator. When you are looking at your files, you should test them in different browsers. So a couple to consider. Chrome is the most commonly used on mobile devices. So if you are looking at how your website looks on a mobile device, you definitely want to check it with Chrome. In addition to any other browser that you want, Firefox is most commonly used on PC desktops. And then Safari is most commonly used on Mac devices, both desktop and mobile. Next, you need to make sure that you consider accessibility testing to determine whether a website meets accessibility requirements. You can visit the two links below. At these two websites, you can go and place a link and have them give you feedback on whether or not it's accessible. You can also find these two links under the resources category. Usability testing. Here are a couple of different things to consider when you are doing usability testing. To evaluate the website, you will want to consider the following. Intuitive design, how easy it is for a new user to understand the organization of the site. Ease of learning, how do experienced users perceive the website. Efficiency of use, how do experienced users perceive the website. Memorability, when a visitor returns to a website, Do they remember enough to use it productively? Error frequency and severity. Do visitors make errors? How easy is it to recover from the error? Subject satisfaction. Do users like using the website? So what I want us to do with this is actually practice this in action. So we're going to go back to the website that we visited in the other video, this Johnson County website, jocogov.org, and I want you to go to the discussion thread for this, and I want you to answer each of these following items and take a look at each of these categories for this website. And then I want you to rank how the website does, let's say a score out of 10, and then give an overall ranking for this. Alright, hopping back to Canvas, you can see those same links that we looked at. If you go to the web publishing subsection, we have our PowerPoint, these different resource links, validator, the accessibility links, and then your homework for this week.